Hello and welcome to episode four of Jermyn Street Theatre's podcast Prompt Corner. Today we're going to be talking about sound and music, and we have Matt Eaton, Max Pappenheim, Yvonne Gilbert and Tom Attwood, all who've done work for Jermyn Street Theatre in the past. So enjoy the episode. So welcome to Prompt Corner. If you'd all like to go round and maybe introduce yourself, should we start with you, Matt?
Certainly. It's Matt Eaton. I'm a composer and sound designer with an interest in sound art. That's it, really, for the purposes of this podcast.
Right. How about you, Yvonne?
I'm a sound designer and with a previous history of mixing West End musicals. So although I do plays too, musicals is kind of really the base of what I do, of what I like to do.
Nice. And Max?
Hello, I'm Max Pappenheim. I'm a sound designer and composer with a background in music. So I came slightly sideways into sound design through the music side.
Perfect. And last but not least, Tom?
Oh, hello. Yes, I'm Tom Attwood. It's sort of like a mixed bag, but most things in the mixed bag include some sort of noise. Music, arrangements of musicals for actor musicians is sort of my main focus, and then occasionally composition for plays and sound design for plays as well.
Brilliant. So we're all coming from very different, varied backgrounds, but all kind of pooling together, I suppose, having a common interest in designing sound and music for theatre, I suppose. And maybe a first question I would love to ask you all is, what is the importance of sound within theatre? What do you think, what purpose does it serve?
You can start with the big one. It's another language, isn't it? It's one of the other languages that's not text and not stage and not lights, you know. Often neglected. It was neglected up until somebody else might be correct, up until the 1940s, 50s. Now it's not.
I think what makes sound interesting in theatre is that it's a shared experience, so we're all ostensibly experiencing the same product, but everything we see because we choose to look at it. Whereas what we hear sort of slightly bypasses that, and I suppose that's what makes sound and music so powerful as an element, and sort of unique as an element in that it's not a choice for each spectator to open their ears to this particular bit of noise. It's sent at them and they can't opt out.
For sure. So in that way, it's a very universal experience that kind of is completely necessary to theatre, if we're talking about it with sensation and with the idea of how you feel in it.
Yeah, it's a useful tool to set the mood without, to kind of sneak that in on the audience without being hopefully too obvious about it. So you can pre-set up the mood of the next scene with the scene change, or it's a useful way to segue between the mood or the story that has been told in a previous scene and make that transition smoother or more abrupt if that's what you and the director have chosen to do. But I agree with Tom that it's if done well, it's something that the audience aren't necessarily aware of. So, you can make them feel something without them knowing why they're feeling it. And very much in collaboration with the set and the lighting design, absolutely.
And so in that sense, that's really interesting. You talk about it with the words to try and sneak it in, or to try and be an experience that is definitely part of the whole, but doesn't necessarily enforce itself in the same way that a set might do visually for people. And so how does that affect your process? Perhaps Max, you could talk a little bit about that. How does that affect the way you kind of approach sound design?
Well, I think the other thing about sound is that because the text of the play And indeed, so much of what the actors are doing and so much of their training is obviously based around the human voice and about the audience hearing that voice, both hearing it clearly when we want it to be clear and hearing it unclearly when we want it to be unclear, but also about the tone of the voice and the way that the actors are communicating with each other and with us, what we're meant to hear, what we're meant to overhear, and so on. And so we spend an awful lot of time actually working on the fundamentals like that as well. So it's a funny role in the same way that lighting designers work both with making pictures that are emotionally, dramatically communicative, but also making sure the audience can see the actors' faces. We spend an awful lot of time making sure, often in a hidden and subtle way that sometimes doesn't even feel like it should be part of a sound designer's remit, but just making sure that the sounds can be heard in the right kind of way.
Definitely. So does that mean that you come to the process? What's your starting point, I suppose, is what I mean to ask. Where do you start with? Do you start with preconceptions about a text because you might have been told things about it or you've read the text particularly? Because that's really interesting, Max, that you talk about the way that it interacts with the human voice on the stage. So presumably it's a multi-layered, multi-stage process which develops as you go through it, depending on the different amounts of interaction you have with the other facets of theatre.
Yeah, it tends to vary, as all things in design, in all kinds of design too. But particularly, I think, as a sound designer, my first question about a play is going to be, what's it like? Because in sound, we're constantly dealing with what it's like, what it feels like, what the style is. Because sound, as Yvonne says, sound has so many different ways of contributing and helping and clarifying that. Not least because sound does both literal really well, because we recognize such and such a sound, and it does ambiguous really well. Was that a scream, or was that a screech of some squeaking metal, or a bird, or someone laughing, this sort of thing? So the first questions in any process, even sometimes before reading the text at all, the first questions often that we'll be interested in will be stylistic ones or emotional ones. What's the vibe? Because with sound, we're going to be dealing with a vibe.
Sure. And that's really interesting. You relate it to association as well. So you're playing on a very intimate, like emotional, psychological level with how people already interact with sound in their daily lives. Would that be true to say?
I'd say for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, you're nodding enthusiasly.
Yes, I suppose I was just thinking that you can't hear me nodding. This is, I mean, that's the first in the world of sound. I can't hear you nodding on this podcast. But I suppose we tend to think of, we have quite clear ideas in our head, preconceived ideas about what something sounds like, which is nearly always very different to what something actually sounds like. And so so part of what I think Max is discussing there is, for the purposes of this play, of this story, what is that interface between what we think something sounds like and what something actually sounds like? That's often, but again, I suppose it's what am I going to do to augment the story? I think that's sort of where I would start. It's what is the story we're trying to tell? Why are we trying to tell it? What can I do to augment it?
Brilliant. And so I thought we might talk a little bit about maybe the history of sound design, because I feel as though, I mean, it's changed a lot recently, hasn't it? Has it gone through this very kind of drastic change with the advance of new technologies that mean that kind of practical sound effects are dealt with in a different way? Would that be true to say?
Yes. Well, I caught the end of the mini disc era and the beginning of the computer era. So yes, it has changed. It's changed a lot, from thunder sheets and rolling cannonballs down tracks above the audience, which sounds like an incredible thing to do. I think we should go back to that, to be honest.
Yeah, that's
cannonballs and thunder sheets and the practical things.
Yeah. So that obviously appeals in a very different way theatrically as well, because it's a live action, isn't it? It's a part of performance that isn't necessarily something recorded. So is that quite a large kind of discussion? Is that quite a large facet of all your work?
It's probably not something that a sound design would bring to a process late on. it's something that would have to be there from the start. Yeah, I'm quite fond of is live Foley, the unnatural miking up of a cast for a symbolic effect or language.
Has that generally waned though throughout kind of the development of sound design? Is that something that people are doing less and less?
Well, it's waned in one way, that it's I suppose it's like sort of digital technology. It's we sacrifice all of that for convenience, and now some of it is being brought back for artistic purposes.
I just did a season in York last year of they rebuilt the Rose Theatre, which was all Shakespearean, and although there were some microphones, it was basically old school Foley as well. I mean, I played some cannon fire. We didn't actually have a cannon. No. But apart from that, there were, chains being thrown from galleries and things like that. So, which was really good fun, and I really enjoyed doing it. So I guess it's in more of a historical context. People still do that. Foley, it's still live Foley. I love doing that.
Well, we can do so much with it now, can't we? Because we can process all of this stuff to our heart's content, and you can change rubbing a carpet into rainfall, typewriters into rain, things like that. I was doing that earlier this year, just with processing those sounds through live.
Was any of that live, Matt, or was that all?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic! So you started with a typewriter that
it was an Orlando. She was it was the narrator, stroke Virginia Woolf, playing a typewriter, and that's processed, put through I think even type plugins and the waves and all of that, and we turned it into rainfall.
You did that with just manipulation, or did you then play rainfall over the top of it, or you just?
And then you crossfaded into real rain.
How lovely.
But does that form? I know that's an instance of that sort of live Foley, but does recording kind of sounds? Does that form a large part of your practices? Is that something that you still do?
Yeah, I've got quite into that actually. Doing my own. For convenience, we will use sound libraries most of the time. I would say. I mean, Yvonne and Max, do correct me if I'm wrong, but I use mostly sound libraries because I have, obviously we don't have time to go out and record every little bit and bob of sound design. But it's something wonderfully rewarding about making your own recordings. Hugely.
My partner gets very upset when we're off on holiday, and I say, "Oh, do you mind if I just those crickets are great or whatever."
Brilliant.
3 hours later.
Yeah.
Those crickets with a Cornwall accent.
Exactly.
Well, you may joke, Tom.
Well, this is an interesting question. Do you guys find yourself? I mean, are you self-confessed obsessives about sound? Is it something that you think about all the time, or are you quite easily able to separate it from the work that you do?
Weirdly, I've been using lockdown to try and find a hobby that isn't sound related. Because if I have time off, I'm probably sat in this chair making some music, writing music for myself or other projects, projects which don't pay a wage. So no, I don't really have any hobbies outside of sound and music. It's a broad church though, to be fair.
I did want to ask as well if you guys had if you do record Foley tracks, what's the strangest sound you've ever recorded?
Oh, I've got one for you. I had a gig in Florida just before lockdown, and I've been over there quite a few times to the University of South Florida, and I have never come face to face with an alligator, which are quite common out there. So I went looking for alligators. I thought this is probably the last time that I'm going to come out for this gig because it's over. I saw an alligator in a park, left the boardwalk with my little Yamaha recorder, and literally walked past it. I must have been within about 6 feet of this fairly chunky alligator, and I heard a big splash behind me, basically.
I'm trying to think what the weirdest thing I've recorded is. I recorded myself slurping a cup of tea, and which was for some ridiculous thing which needed some heightened nonsense for somebody to, and that I remember spending far too much time on that and quite quickly losing the will to live. One of those moments where you're going for the fifth take of this slurp of a cup of tea, and you think, "What am I doing? What am I doing? There was so much potential in my life when I was at school, and here I am slurping a cup of tea." I think that I suppose on the weirder end of the spectrum.
A percussion track from Eating an Apple. I mean, that's thinking about it. The Beach Boys were probably 40 years ahead of me with that. Yeah.
The thing I find with sound libraries is that they're often not in, particularly if you're doing regional theatre in the UK, they're not in the right accent if you want crowd themes. So you have to, all that stuff you have to record, because there isn't that big call for a party full of people with Manchester accents, or nobody's going to make a living selling sound libraries doing that. So all that kind of stuff you have to record yourself, and a Zoom with just a 414 attached or something is really very easy and quick to just to in the rehearsal room to get the cast to help you out and record some extra stuff.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. And sometimes the what you would find in a sound library doesn't have the musicality that you need it to have for the scene in which you want to deploy the effect. So it's not that you can't find the right series of bird calls. It's that the bird calls aren't emotionally as close to what you need them to do for the scene. So that's when you start having to sort of remake it to deliver what you want.
It's a long time since I've used real bird song in a play. I use this kind of for ring modulated, reverbed bird song, which kind of works as a sort of universal signifier for bird song, if you see what I mean. And I find realistic. We don't need naturalism and realism isn't necessary so much.
You find yourself getting caught up with, because I can go down a rabbit hole of seasonally correct birdsong, just to try to tap into that thing of what says autumn to us, and like we were talking about earlier about being able to set the scene without saying very much. So and how do you find that works with stuff that you generate, or do you just think it's not? Is it often not something that you think is important in the particular show that you're doing?
It depends on the production, I'd say no. It is important. It's just finding something that signifies that, and sounds good. Like Max said, the vibe is right. So I find myself moving away from literal depictions all the time, unless specifically requested.
Why is that? What is it? Is it to do with that thing that you mentioned about the fact that what we expect is different from what it actually sounds like?
It's the artificiality. We're kind of painting a picture with sound. I think I didn't really articulate this until a few years ago, and quite often it's we're sat in a theatre under artificial light. So why are we using naturalistic sound? And there's always a case for doing this, but it shouldn't be the default, I don't think.
And no other element nothing is real.
No.
So there's a level of expression to everything, and I suppose Matt's saying that if you come crashing in with the realist sound ever, all it's going to do is remind everybody that set is made of 2-inch ply.
Yeah, it's that, Tom. Yeah.
Also, tastes change. Audience tastes are heavily influenced, particularly in the last 2 years. TV and film have really changed expectations of what sound will be like and what the language is. So a lot of the time, I mean, gunshots, for example, my least favourite thing in theatre. Because of course, what an audience, I feel that what an audience really wants is something that sounds like it does in the movies.
Mm.
What they don't want is an explosion on stage, which is often what a director's keen for particular, very specific reasons. And so there's a tightrope to walk between the two of what's real, what's realistic, and what an audience will take what they need to take from.
The gunshots thing is really interesting. I always think of it, I want to depict how it feels when you hear it, rather than the literal sound, if you see what I mean.
Max, you bring up film and TV. Does that have a lot to bear on your work? Do you guys do a lot of work in film or TV? Is it very different to theatre?
As a slight aside, one thing which I found very instructive was working in radio drama, first of all, and learning that way about how it is that people listen, exactly what aspect of a sound people home in on. We had one interesting moment where we were dealing with an antique pistol being handled, and we got hold of the actual an actual pistol or very close to the original model, and it just didn't sound like anything. So then we pulled a stapler out of the cupboard and whacked that around, and it sounded exactly like somebody handling a gun, presumably because, again, that's the kind of Foley work that people are used to in movies and TV.
So it bears quite a lot on the expectations that audiences have. And is that something you learn by doing it again and again, by understanding what is successful theatrically and what people want?
Yeah, and the director's expectations are huge. I've had a show that had a polar bear in it and had an animatronic polar bear, with people in it, and we had a reverse radio in it. And as soon as you play a polar bear sound, people go, "That's the dinosaur," and it's not a dinosaur. Obviously, it's just what they used in Jurassic Park. And I ended up having to change it for something else because the director was so adamant that everybody's just going to think, "Why is there a dinosaur?" So, yeah, the realism versus expectations is a huge thing.
A great gift in theatre is a preview period where we can see everything in context and ask ourselves very honestly, what does this sound like? Is this landing right? Are the audience looking at each other going, "What was that?" Or are they all laughing their heads off because it's Jurassic Park?
Yeah, and they were.
Do you find as though you have to change stuff quite a lot through that preview process?
Oh, I find that it's literally every preview is up 5 dB, down 5 dB. Every cue. Bit louder. Oh no, that was too loud. A bit quieter. And literally, and then where you add it to start with is fine. Is always fine. I suppose what sets sound again apart perhaps from some other elements is that you can't do any of it. You can't ask everybody to stand still while you adjust it. Which I suppose to make the comparison to lighting, you can't just say everybody just stay where you are. We're just gonna do. It all has to run to time. So I suppose that's why the preview period is so crucial, because you need everybody to start at the beginning and get to the end in order to really get a sense that is this Jurassic Park or those marigolds I've flapped in the cleaner's cupboard and recorded on my phone, have they done for wings,
And often actually with a musical, with a band, anything that's got a live band on it, generally you don't get them until the preview. I mean, you may be very, very lucky and get them at the end, at the right side of the tech or the start of the tech. You might get a sound check so you can have a stab at setting levels over the top of it. But generally, you get a dress rehearsal with the band that then wipes out every single sound effect level-wise. And the previews are the only time you really get to work on it with the band, which is, at any length of a run, you don't get to do it to the audience. I mean, really, you get a sound check, but so the previews are really important.
Speaking about kind of a musical aspect to it, Matt, you do a lot of musical work as well, don't you? Do you feel as though your experience in sound design affects the way you play music?
Yes. I mean, it does. It started to feed back in over the past few years. Actually, Yeah. Yes, it does. I'm going to find it hard to articulate, but I'll give it a go. I've gone back to a lot more of an experimental form, emboldened by my work with working with raw sound and using sounds, symbolically.
Mm-hmm.
Does inverted commas with fingers. And also, storytelling and narrative. It's become quite important. I went off lyrics for a long time, and now I find I was thinking only the other day that I need some kind of narrative in my life, in music, and I can make that with sound, but incorporating text and words and stories into music is what I'm looking at the moment.
So, Tom, speaking about music, you've got some experience in doing some teaching in actor musicianship, which I suppose leads us back into what we were talking about earlier with that sort of performance sort of thing. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose there's I do some teaching on the ex-musician course at Rose Bruford, and obviously now we're in the world of lockdown and online lockdown. It's so depressing. It's such a depressing name. But now we're in the sort of doing online classes. We're sort of having to just adjust the modality of the work we're asking them to do. And so much of the acts musician work is normally about ensemble and something sort of connected and spiritual. And now it feels like we're asking them to work separately. And of course, the internet is now awash with pit bands, choirs, casts doing these. Oh, we put together this recording. We all just got together and we just made this Zoom, and we just all got on Zoom and we all started singing at the same time. And of course, it's complete nonsense because it wouldn't work, but because of the latency, it just wouldn't work. So everyone's had to record their bits separately. And so then you're suddenly going, oh well, if everyone's had to record their bits separately, why do they always make such a fuss about wanting to hear each other? Why do we always make such a fuss about needing to connect and hear each other when actually you've all recorded your bits separately to a tiny guide track or a tiny click track? So next time you complain that there isn't enough monitoring, I'll remind you of how during lockdown you weren't even in the same room and you couldn't hear each other. And I think with that mini rant over, put that there. I think with the actor musician work, I think that's what we're finding interesting is how do you continue to find those holistic connections that you would have if you were actually in a rehearsal room, whilst using some technology, but specifically with the majority of these actor musician students, not the course isn't a technology course. So there might be 2 or 3 of them that are really interested in pursuing composition or mixing or something that involves the technology, but most of them want to be on the stage performing. So what is the easiest technology flow to enable us to continue to do the work? I think that's what we've found interesting over the last few weeks. It's been a bit of a baptism of fire. And of course, you're limited by the fact that you can't go round there and just install it on their computer. You can't. There comes a point where you can't help them anymore. So you have to come up with a new task.
So you're talking about the kind of the normal situation would be actors who also perform music as well, kind of like integrated into the soundscape of a show, right? And so that's an interesting suggestion that obviously the situation that we're in at the moment, which is obviously not ideal for anybody, has kind of hindered that in a very kind of real, very immediate way. Has that been the case for a lot of you others as well, in terms of sound design and obviously hindering work, but also the aspect that Tom mentions in terms of the personal kind of real immediate interaction that sound necessitates in a normal situation?
I mean, I would say for me, everything, there is no more work, everything's gone or postponed indefinitely. So, I've had vague conversations with people that I worked with before about maybe doing an audio, about maybe doing an audio drama, but that's as far as any work discussions have gone. It just dropped off the mat. I'm sure that's the same for just about anyone in live performance that isn't in a regular kind of, that doesn't have a regular kind of side gig or a teaching gig or work for an institution. So it's completely different because there's nothing that the projects are saying they will come back. Who knows legally when that will be?
The way that we're interacting with each other now, maybe more people are like, in an amateur sense, turning to sound where they might not have done before, because it's a kind of like a digital way to kind of communicate with each other. Well, there's an interesting relationship there between the kind of the technical aspect of your work and the emotional aspect of your work. And maybe that might lead us into a discussion of that. Like, how much do you think normally you have to negotiate that balance between technical and emotional, which we've spoken about before, and how has that changed in this new situation?
I've always seen it as a very old-fashioned craft in a way, although sound is very new. And in my head, it's kind of like the stonemason or a carpenter, in that you have to learn the practical things before you can be expressive with it. And that's how I see the technical building blocks, in that it's easier to be expressive adequately or in the way that you want to be if you know how to do the technical bits. And that's just the building blocks of being any old school, craft person, whether that would have been a stonemason or a sculptor, an artist, even a visual artist. You have to learn the techniques first. And then when that becomes inherent and you don't have to think about that bit anymore, that's when you can really do your job properly.
It's a nice way of putting it. Can I borrow that?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
I'm going to borrow the thing about turning a typewriter into rain.
Me too. I think I was asking some questions.
Already a session. I think, I think that's it, isn't it? Because it's art, so it's not like being a mechanic. Whereas if you're a mechanic, you can learn how all the bits of the car work, and therefore you can fix the car. And I suppose what Yvonne's sort of saying is that's just the beginning. Knowing how the bits work is one half of the equation. And but I suppose there is an argument that the two, because the two things interact, you can come at it from one way or the other. You can come at it from, I've got an idea, I want to do something, I don't know how to do that. Now I'll go and find out how to do it. But then your knowledge is then less. The organisation of your knowledge is less structurally sound, I suppose. But who knows? And I think with the current situation, it's interesting to see the necessity with which people are turning to technology. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when the current situation goes away, that they'll continue to want to turn to technology. We'd all rather go and have a coffee and talk about this, because Ciaran, you'd be paying, and
at least for the coffee.
Yeah, I love it. Coffee on the side, and obviously when I say coffee, I mean a beer. But we'd all rather do that than this. So there are some things where the current situation isn't the best, but it's making the best out of it, I suppose.
The thing about technology is that people use it as best they can. People will do whatever it takes to just get something approaching what they want out of it. And it's very common, particularly say in Edinburgh, you might see a production where, as say, from the point of view of whether you were going to grade, how you were going to grade someone on their work as a graduate from a sound design course, you might say, oh, that was dreadful, that the sound effects were all really loud, or whatever it might be. But actually what you've got often is a theatre company who don't have a sound specialist, who have found a laptop and found some sound effects that they downloaded off YouTube or something, and put it all together, and it works brilliantly. no, and that's, I don't mean that in a sort of patronizing, oh, how sweet way, but rather in the fact that right now, Zoom is available, Skype is available. They're not perfect at all. We know that conversations sometimes get a bit jerky as we stop and not sure if someone was talking or whatever, but we turn it to whatever use we can, whatever works for us. And the same is true of theatre. The same is true of many, many different things in theatre as well. And that's one of the glorious things about theatre, that because of the contract between audience and performance, we can accept and get on the same page as whatever it is that we're seeing and hearing, which is a slightly different perspective, I think, but we're seeing it borne out now. There was quite an interesting conversation on the Association of Sound Designers. I don't know if I shouldn't give this away, but there was a little email chain in which someone said, oh, an actor has got in touch asking for some advice about what microphone they should get to do some recordings at home. And the discussion that came out of it was, is it worth saying to them, look, realistically, you can't launch a voiceover career just from buying a microphone and doing some stuff at home because of X and Y and Z. But B, what are the possibilities if we give people a few pointers so they don't spend lots of money on the wrong things, but what's the best cost benefit if you want to get a microphone so that you can do more things with your voice from home in this situation? And those are the kinds of questions that we're often dealing with in sound. Yeah, we don't have any budget for this production, but how can we achieve a sound which will be distinctive? And that kind of approach, I think, is what we're seeing lots of at the moment, and will continue to, however circumstances change for theatre and performance. People will find the tools that they have around them and use them as best they can, and interesting things will result.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Prompt Corner. Next week we'll be back and we'll be talking to some special guests about August Strindberg and the work that we've put on at Jermyn Street Theatre of his. So do tune in next week. Don't forget, do follow us on our social media channels. That would be great. And yeah, see you soon.